In the summer of 1937, a federal agent drove down a dirt road in the red clay hills of northern Georgia and handed a farmer a check for $8 an acre. The farmer planted what the government told him to plant. His grandson is still paying for it, not in money, in years. In the particular exhaustion of a man who has watched a wall of green eat 30 feet of sky every decade of his life and been told repeatedly that the government had a plan. The plan was herbicide. The herbicide didn't work. What finally brought the wall down wasn't in any federal budget. It wasn't manufactured by any chemical company. It wasn't the product of a laboratory or a 50-year eradication program. It was a herd of goats, an insect that flew in on a cargo plane, and the trees that grew back when nobody was paying attention. Across the American South, the vine that devoured 100 years of farmland is losing. And the thing killing it cost the government almost nothing, because the government didn't do it. Kudzu is Pueraria montana, a vine from East Asia, first introduced at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, where the Japanese government grew it as decorative shade over their pavilion. For the next 50 years, it moved quietly through botanical gardens and the front porches of the South, where people planted it for ornament, and the purple flowers that bloomed in August and smelled faintly of grapes. Nobody worried about it. Then came the Dust Bowl and the Roosevelt administration's need for something that could hold eroding southern soil in place fast, and the career of a soil scientist named Hugh Hammond Bennett, who believed he had found exactly that. Bennett was the first chief of the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. He needed a plant that could grow fast enough to cover bare clay, hold banks against rain, and survive in soil that had grown cotton for 100 years and had nothing left to give. He believed Kudzu was that plant. Starting in 1935, the Soil Conservation Service began paying southern farmers roughly $8 an acre to plant it on depleted land, worth around $170 today. The Civilian Conservation Corps grew kudzu seedlings by the tens of millions in nursery operations across the Southeast. Total formal acreage under those programs ran between 2 and 3 million acres. And then, America fell in love with it. By 1947, there was a Kudzu Club of America with 20,000 members. Kudzu queens at county fairs, kudzu jelly recipes in Better Homes and Gardens. The vine the federal government had paid people to plant became for a decade a point of regional pride. Then, in 1953, the Soil Conservation Service stopped recommending it. In 1970, the USDA listed it as a weed. In 1997, it went on to the federal noxious weed list. And over the 50 years that followed, the same government that had subsidized its planting spent an estimated $500 million trying to kill what it had grown. Roundup, crossbow, tordon, triclopier, herbicide programs in every southern state from Texas to Virginia. The kudzu kept growing, or so everyone said. But here is where the story turns in a way that most people who have ever driven Interstate 75 through Georgia in July have never heard. The numbers the country had been using to measure the disaster were wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong by a factor of 30. The standard figure for kudzu coverage in the United States, the number that appeared in newspaper headlines and policy briefs and ecology textbooks for 4 decades, was 7 million acres. The annual spread rate was cited at 150,000 acres per year. Nobody seemed to know where these figures had originated. They had been repeated so many times they had become fact by repetition. In 2009, a plant ecologist at the University of Maryland named Erwin Forseth, working with U.S. Forest Service researcher James Miller, decided to actually measure. They used satellite imagery. They used Forest Service inventory plots sampled every 5 years to track timber and tree mortality across the Southeast. What they published in 2015 was not a correction, it was a demolition. Actual kudzu coverage in U.S. forest land, roughly 227,000 acres. Annual spread rate, approximately 2,500 acres per year. The 7 million acre catastrophe was a myth, not an exaggeration, a myth. How does a number get 30 times larger than the truth and stay there for 40 years? The answer is what kudzu looks like from a moving car. A kudzu wall along a roadside is 50 feet high and follows the highway for miles. Drive the southeast in summer and the vine seems to cover every visible surface. The mind extrapolates. If it is on every road, it must be everywhere. But kudzu is not everywhere. It is specifically, almost exclusively, at edges, roadsides, abandoned farmland, power line cuts, fence rows, open disturbed ground that nothing else had claimed. What kudzu cannot do, what it has never been able to do, is penetrate a closed forest canopy. Shade kills it. A mature oak hickory canopy blocks enough light at ground level that kudzu cannot photosynthesize enough to maintain itself. The vine retreats, the root starves. The kudzu wall is two-dimensional. It runs along the road, and it does not go deep into the woods behind it. The country had been terrified of a wall and mistaken it for a continent. But a wall running along thousands of miles of highway, shoulder, and railroad right-of-way is still a real problem. $500 million in chemical treatment had not moved it. And then in 2003, a sheep farmer in Maryland named Brian Cash tried something that no government program had funded and no chemical company had recommended. He bought goats. The reason goats work where everything else fails is evolutionary history. Cattle evolved on Eurasian grasslands as bulk grazers. They'll browse young kudzu in the first season, but once the vine matures and the flower opens and the leaf toughens, cattle move on. Sheep do somewhat better. Their jaws will work through young growth, but their narrow muzzles are built for close cropping grass at soil level, not for reaching vines at chest height. Goats are different. Capra hircus was domesticated roughly 10,000 years ago in the mountains of the Middle East and Central Asia, the same geography where kudzu's wild ancestors evolved. Goats and the plants kudzu descends from have occupied the same ecosystem for 10 millennia. The physiology reflects it. A goat eats kudzu top to bottom. Flower first, then leaf, then vine, then the bark off the stem, then the surface of the root crown itself. One adult consumes 6 to 8 pounds of kudzu biomass per day. 100 animals can strip an acre clean in 1 to 2 days. But stripping an acre clean doesn't kill the plant. Underground, beneath a mature kudzu patch, is a root crown. A single crown can weigh 400 pounds and run 7 feet into the earth. It holds 2 to 3 years of concentrated starch, enough fuel to push new growth to the surface within weeks of total defoliation. Cut the vine at ground level, and the root is still full. New growth is up before the soil is dry. What kills the root crown is rotational grazing, 3 to 4 complete grazing cycles over 18 to 24 months, each pass pulling more carbon from the stored starch, until the root exhausts itself and the plant collapses from the inside. The economics followed the biology. Goat rental over a full 18-month clearing cycle runs $300 to $1,000 per acre depending on terrain and density. Herbicide programs over the same period cost $1,500 to $3,000 per acre, plus chemical residue in the soil, plus labor, plus the fact that mechanical mowing kills nothing and requires retreatment every 6 weeks. By 2005, Cash had his first commercial contract. By 2020, more than 100 operators were working across the South, with transportation departments in Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas signing year-over-year contracts. The most effective weapon ever deployed against this vine turned out to be an animal. Half the farms in the South had been keeping in the back pasture for generations. But goats need fences. Kudzu does not. The thousands of miles of highway shoulder, the railroad corridors, the Blue Ridge Parkway, none of it could be enclosed. something else had to handle the open ground. And in 2009, something arrived from across the Pacific that no one had ordered and no government had requested. In October of that year, an entomologist at the University of Georgia named Wayne Gardner began receiving calls about a small brown insect appearing in enormous numbers on Kudzu along the perimeter of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, bean-shaped, 4 to 6 millimeters long, hard-shelled, the color of dried grass. Gardner's lab identified it quickly, Megacopta cribraria, the Kudzu bug. Native to Japan, China, and Korea, and one of Kudzu's principal natural enemies in its home range. It had almost certainly arrived in cargo, 9 detection counties in a tight ring around Hartsfield-Jackson. The geographic signature of an air freight introduction. Megacopta cribraria does something no Native American insect had ever managed. It pierces the vine and sucks the sap. In high enough densities, it reduces photosynthesis to the point where Kudzu biomass declines measurably across the growing season. University of Georgia studies documented reductions of roughly 33% per season in established infestations. Within 5 years, the insect had spread to 13 states: Tennessee, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, moving on the wind, moving on vehicles, moving wherever the Kudzu was. For about 3 years, this looked like the cleanest accidental biological control event in American environmental history. A specialist predator that arrived uninvited, attacked the target, and required no government program and no funding whatsoever. Then the soybean farmers started calling. Soybeans are in the same plant family as Kudzu, Fabaceae, and Megacopta cribraria did not distinguish between Asian Kudzu and American soybeans. The U.S. soybean industry is worth approximately $40 billion annually, the second largest field crop in the country. In 2013 and 2014, fields across Georgia and Alabama began reporting yield losses between 20 and 60% in heavily infested areas. The cure had become its own disease. The USDA identified the Kudzu bug's primary natural enemy in Asia, a parasitoid wasp called Paratelinomus saccharalis, which lays its eggs inside Kudzu bug eggs and whose larva consumes the host from within. Releases began around 2017. The wasp established. Kudzu bug densities declined 60 to 80% from peak across most of the southeast by the mid-2020s. The Kudzu bug, now at lower density, was still attacking the vine. Soybean damage had become manageable. What had started as one accidental introduction had become 3. A vine brought to save the soil, an insect that arrived uninvited to eat the vine, a wasp released to control the insect. Each one finding its place in a food web the government had never designed and would never have approved. The third force is the one nobody talks about. It requires no action, no budget, no press release. It is simply what happens when you stop cutting trees down. Kudzu cannot survive in closed shade. This is not a partial vulnerability, it is absolute. A mature canopy of eastern oak hickory, pine hardwood mix, or even a closed second growth plantation blocks enough light at ground level that Kudzu cannot photosynthesize enough to maintain itself. The vine retreats, the root crown shrinks. Within a few growing seasons beneath a closed canopy, the Kudzu is gone, without anyone touching it. This is why the 7 million acre estimate was so wrong. Forsyth and Miller's data showed it clearly. Where the canopy was closed, Kudzu was absent. Where it had been opened, by clear-cutting, road construction, thinning, Kudzu appeared. The vine was always an edge species. It cannot live in the interior of a forest. It can only live at the forest's wounds. And across the rural South, the wounds were healing. When cotton agriculture collapsed in the mid-20th century, abandoned farmland didn't stay bare. Loblolly pine came up on its own across millions of acres. Oak and hickory followed. As the canopy closed, The Kudzu beneath was dying in silence. No chemical, no machinery, no budget line. In 2018, the U.S. Forest Service formally ended dedicated funding for Kudzu eradication on national forest land in the southeast. The data had been pointing to the same conclusion for years. Where forests were managed for canopy closure, Kudzu vanished without any intervention at all. Where management opened the canopy, Kudzu returned. The forest was not the place Kudzu needed to be fought. The forest was already doing the fighting. So consider what actually happened. The United States spent roughly $500 million over 50 years trying to kill a vine with chemistry. The vine did not die. Then three things happened that the government did not fund, did not plan, and in one case, did not want. A sheep farmer bought goats and discovered that rotational grazing could exhaust a root crown that herbicide could not reach. A cargo plane landed in Atlanta carrying an insect that had been eating kudzu in Asia for millions of years, and it spread to 13 states and reduced kudzu biomass by a third per season. And the forests cleared for cotton in the 1800s grew back over abandoned fields and shaded the vine out from below. Three different mechanisms, three different parts of the landscape: goats on the fenced ground, the kudzu bug across the open corridors, the forest canopy in the deep interior, the simultaneous pressure across the full range that 50 years of herbicide programs never achieved. Three living systems were already delivering it for free because the conditions for each already existed. Forest Service data in the states with the most consistent measurement shows total kudzu coverage has declined 18 to 25% from peak. No federal eradication program achieved that. The goat farmers did part of it. The insect that arrived uninvited at Atlanta did part of it. The trees that grew back when nobody was cutting them did the rest. There is a lesson buried in this that is harder to see than the kudzu wall. The country spent 90 years trying to correct a mistake with chemistry, with engineering, with federal programs and line items, and it kept working against the natural systems already moving in the right direction. The goats, the bug, and the forest were not inventions. They were ecological relationships that predated the mistake and reasserted themselves the moment the conditions allowed it. Every dollar spent on herbicide was a dollar spent avoiding the question of what the land was already doing. The answer turned out to be exactly what was needed. It just needed room. Somewhere in the red clay hills of northern Georgia, there is a hillside where a kudzu wall stood for 70 years. The wall is gone now. In its place is bare clay turning slowly back to native grass, the edge of young forest beginning to close in from the tree line. Nobody planted the grass. Nobody seeded the trees. The goats ate the vine. The bug weakened what the goats missed. The forest is doing the rest. The government paid $8 an acre in 1937 to create the problem. The solution cost almost nothing. The land, given time, and the right organisms applying the right pressure, does not need to be told how to heal. It already knows. It has always known. We just had to stop spending money on ways to get in the way of it.